Good morning and welcome to our second annual Fair Housing Summit, brought to you by Oregon Realtors. For those who don't know me, my name is Grace Bergen, and I'm the Oregon Realtors 2023 president and a broker at Tallfors Realty in Eugene. We are grateful to have you here today to learn and dialogue with us about fair housing issues within the state of Oregon. This kicks off my Presidential Fair Housing Challenge, in which we ask all of you to complete a variety of fair housing education to raise the bar here in Oregon. So thank you so much for your commitment. We are looking for full engagement here. So we'd like for you to ask you all to turn on your videos. No one wants to present to black boxes. We also want to ensure a productive civil conversation for everyone. Attendees who post inflammatory, disrespectful, or unrelated messages or opinions within the chat will be removed from the Fair Housing Summit without a refund or continuing education credits. We thank you all so much for engaging in this event with the spirit of learning and respect. Today, we're going to hear from industry experts on fair housing from many different perspectives. Our MC will be the incredible Latasha Beal, my dear friend, chair of the 2023 Oregon Realtors Diversity Key Committee. It is my honor to introduce her and pass the mic on over. Hey, Latasha.
Hey, Grace. Thank you so much for that introduction. Welcome. We've got a full agenda today. We'll start with the historic lens. How did Oregon get to be the way that it is? Then we'll hear from our keynote and returning presenter, Richard Rothstein, who presented last year on The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of the Government Segregated America. Richard will be joined by his daughter, Leah Rothstein, who collaborated with him to write their upcoming book, Just Action: How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. Then we'll take some time to look at the data before zooming in on Oregon and hearing from groups who are doing the work to increase housing access within their communities. The final panel is going to give us practical tips on how we can center fair housing in our work with clients. We hope everyone who joins us leaves today with some new insights and things to consider. Before we introduce our first presenter, I wanted to thank our partners, Canopy Mortgage, First American Title, and Urban Nest Realty. Thank you so much for your support of this summit and commitment to fair housing. One last wayfinding detail. After the summit, we will send out all the resources and links discussed so you don't have to furiously take notes or copy everything in the chat. We got you covered. Let's start with setting the stage. Why does Oregon home ownership look the way it does? To help us answer that question is the Education and Outreach Director at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, Shail Reuter. Prior to her work at Fair Housing Council of Oregon, Shail worked in HIV/AIDS services for 19 years, with 14 of those years focused on housing services for people living with HIV/AIDS. As part of that work, she has taught about fair housing rights since 2001. She holds a master's degree in post-secondary adult continuing education from PSU. Please turn your cameras on and join me in welcoming Shail.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Latasha. I really appreciate it. We are very excited to be here today and to be presenting, and I personally am very excited to be here and present so that you have a better understanding of the housing landscape and the disparities that we see in housing today in Oregon. So we're going to go over what is a well-known history for some and not a well-known history for others. And as I'm presenting this information, I'm just going to say that sometimes it can be hard to hear for people. It can be hard to hear because it might be new, or it can be hard to hear because it's part of your community's story, and that can be difficult. So what I'm going to say is, please take care of yourself however you need to during this presentation. I also just want to give a note about language. As we're talking about the history of Oregon and we're reading actual laws that are put in place, we're going to see some of that antiquated language that we no longer use. But to stay true to the history and understand the tenor of the times of what we've been dealing with and what brought us to today, we're going to stay true to that language that was in place in the past. So I work for an organization called the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. We are a private nonprofit organization. We serve the entire state of Oregon. And I should also mention that the research that went into this presentation was funded by a grant through Housing and Urban Development, HUD. So what do we do as an organization? Our whole mission, we are a nonprofit organization. I have team members in Southern Oregon, Eastern Oregon, Central Oregon, North Central Coastal Region, Greater Willamette Valley area, the Portland Metro region. So quite a large landmass that we cover. And our mission is to identify and eliminate illegal housing discrimination through education and enforcement. So education like this, where we're talking about the history, where these laws came into play, why we have them in the first place, also what the laws are, we talk about that. And then also when our educational efforts don't work, we have an enforcement team where people can contact if they feel they've experienced housing discrimination. Now, something really important to think about is that realtors can also take part in making sure that this is a fair and equitable housing market in Oregon. So we'll talk more about ways that realtors can actually be advocates and report as well. We also promote housing choice and usher greater equity into the Oregon's housing and rental markets as well. And we as an organization really embrace the role of realtors and housing providers who work with us to help fulfill this mission. So what is fair housing? Let's talk about that. It's really civil rights in housing. So we think civil rights, and oftentimes we think, okay, I shouldn't be treated differently because of the color of my skin or the country that I'm from, or because of my gender or gender identity. We think about those things. This is that same set of laws, and it's applied specifically to housing. And so then what is fair housing? Well, it's the right of all people to be free from discrimination in the rental, sale, or financing of housing. So these laws cover all types of housing processes. So the basics of fair housing. People have the right to choose where they live, regardless of their protected class. Really, they should qualify. Like the decision about, should they be able to live somewhere or not live somewhere should all be based on, do they qualify? Financially, do they qualify? Does their background check qualify? And realtors need to be consistent in responding to inquiries from prospects, in carrying out practices and procedures, in conducting all aspects of the transaction. You have a role in this. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that is after we talk about the history. So let's talk about what these protected identities are. You've heard me say protected classes a few times. On the federal level, we have race, color, national origin, and religion. These were the first 4 protected classes that were added in 1968. Then in 1974, as part of the women's movement, we see sex being added as a protected class. Sex also includes survivorship of domestic violence, because the majority of people who are survivors of domestic violence identify as women or femme. Now, also sexual orientation and gender identity is protected at the federal level now under this current presidential administration. Familial status, meaning families with children under the age of 18, that was protected as of 1988. And disability was also protected as of 1988 with part of the independent living movement. Now, something to mention is for a housing act to be considered discriminatory based on fair housing, we have to be able to tie differential treatment specifically to one of these protected groups. So I was doing a presentation to realtors in Southern Oregon, and I just said, hey, what does discrimination look like down here? And one realtor said, I don't really hear about it. I don't think we have a lot of discrimination going on. And then another realtor raised her hand and she said, I was trying to sell a condo in an HOA community, and the HOA board president told me specifically that he didn't want me selling the condo to somebody with a child or somebody with an assistance animal, which is based on disability. So, and this is within the last year. So, what we know is housing discrimination is still alive and well. So Oregon goes on to add marital status. So if somebody's married, single, widowed, or divorced, it shouldn't matter in a housing transaction. Source of income, meaning if they've got a Section 8 voucher, housing choice voucher, that also shouldn't matter. We recommend also that housing providers assume TANF, SSI, and SSDI are part of this protected class, because cases have settled on behalf of a complainant when they've been discriminated against based on that. Sexual orientation, gender identity is also protected in the state of Oregon. And then additional jurisdictional protections also may apply based on where you are throughout the state of Oregon. So, for example, in Portland and Beaverton, occupation and age over 18 is added. In Eugene, occupation and age over 18 is added, as well as domestic partnership and ethnicity. So important to know what protections are in place within your area that you serve. So the Fair Housing Act's reach. So fair housing applies essentially to all housing, to everyone, anybody who touches the housing process, and it applies at all times. So we're going to now look back at history to understand the type of discrimination that we see today in Oregon. So let's talk a little bit about Oregon's demographics. Oregon is a really, really white state, especially when you compare us to national average. So nationally, African-American people make up about 13% of the entire population. And in Oregon, it's only about 2 to 3%. Portland itself is actually considered to be the whitest major city in the entire country. And what we see throughout the state is concentrations of people with the same race and or national origin in specific neighborhoods and communities. So really what we're seeing is a lot of people staying very siloed within their communities. So one of the things when we're doing these presentations to predominantly white audiences, what we find is people don't realize the prevalence of discrimination. And oftentimes it's because we become so isolated within our communities that we're not actually interacting in a way where we can understand the types of discrimination that communities are experiencing. So let's go all the way back. We're going to go all the way back to Oregon before it was a territory and when it became a territory. What we saw prior to Oregon becoming a territory is that there were many bands of indigenous people, and you see the map on the bottom left of the slide. This is actually a very clear map of where different tribes lived within the state of Oregon. And what we saw is with the settlement of the area, so there were more than 60 tribes that flourished in Oregon, and with the settlement of the area, the territory, by the mid-1800s, more than 80% of the indigenous population had perished because of epidemics that were brought by white people. So I don't know about you, but I am from Kearney, Nebraska, and Kearney, Nebraska is right along the Oregon Trail. And so the first house I lived in was literally less than a mile from where the trail had run. And we talked a lot about the Oregon Trail when I was in school, but one of the things that we never mentioned was the Oregon Trail was actually designed for white people only. So with the 1850 Oregon Land Donation Act, that precipitated the creation of the trail so white settlers would travel along that trail and get a very large parcel of land at the end of it. So people were given 320-acre parcels of land. So as a realtor, I want you to consider the value of a 320-acre parcel of land today. Also, if a settler, a white male settler, was married, he would get twice that. He would get 640-acre parcels. So if the Oregon Trail is meant for whites only, what we're seeing as far as the real estate game is we are seeing one group of people get a huge starting line advantage when it comes to, generational wealth accrual, financial wellness, all of those things. So imagine the increase of value on those properties today. By the 1850s, most of the tribes, the indigenous peoples that were remaining in the Oregon Territory, were forced onto reservations. Oregon was the only state to exclude African-American people. So there was this debate that was going on about should the territory allow the institution of slavery or should it not allow the institution of slavery? And it was decided that the institution of slavery would not be allowed in Oregon. And we would love to believe that this is because, morally it's the right thing to do, but the decision was actually made based on economics. People believed that it created an unfair work advantage or work competition if there was free labor that was happening in the state. So the decision was, we will not allow the institution of slavery in Oregon or in the territory before we became a state. So then the next decision is, should African Americans, should Black Americans be allowed in the Oregon Territory and in Oregon as a state? That decision then was also no. And so what we see is in law, Oregon Territory Law, 1844, 1849, there are actually exclusion laws that are written into the laws. They were adopted then also at the time that Oregon became a state. Now, when we were a territory, there was something on the books that was called Lash laws that meant that if a Black American was found in the territory, that they would be publicly whipped by a constable of the proper county every 6 months until they leave the territory. So let's be really clear about the message then that is sent to non-white settlers. It's very clear, you are not welcome here. You can be physically punished and harmed if you try to be here. So we start to think about, why is Oregon so white? Well, we were designed to be that way from the very beginning. In 1859, Oregon is admitted into the Union as a free state, but these exclusion laws are written into the Constitution. In 1926, the exclusion is finally repealed. However, the language was not lifted from our Constitution until 2002. In addition to there being an anti-Black American sentiment, there was also an anti-Chinese sentiment. So in 1850s, the Chinese started arriving into Oregon, and they were really escaping wars, natural disasters, poverty. And in 1859, the Chinese Exclusion Act was written into law, which meant that Chinese could no longer come into the country. Now, Chinese, of course, were doing a lot of really dangerous, difficult manual labor. This exclusion law was not actually repealed from our Constitution until the 1940s, when China was our ally in World War II. So in 1861 to 1863, we see large numbers of Chinese moving to Eastern and Southern Oregon, specifically following the discovery of gold. And then in 1859, when Oregon becomes an actual state admitted to the Union, the Constitution actually prohibits Chinese from owning real estate. So a quote from the Constitution at that time: "No Chinaman, not a resident of the state at the adoption of this Constitution, shall ever hold any real estate or work in any mining claim therein." And this again was not repealed until 1943, when China was an ally to the United States in World War II. So the anti-Chinese sentiment, of course, continues. Chinese people experience ongoing harassment. And in the 1880s, there's an economic depression that hits up and down the West Coast. And one of the things that we know, like if we look back at history, during challenging economic times, people look for someone to blame. And often who gets blamed are immigrant and refugee groups. And so the 1880s, no different, right? The Chinese are being blamed for, the economic depression. So in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed, saying no more Chinese can come into the country, not repealed until 1943. And we saw anti-Chinese violence up and down the West Coast as well. And many Chinese people then were escaping to Portland, specifically because it is safer to live in larger communities than to live in smaller sort of outposted areas where we might not have the safety in numbers. Also, in Eastern and Southern Oregon, there were fewer railroad jobs. People were being pushed out of mining, and there was violence from the white workers. Many people also, so some folks don't know this about Portland, but like in Portland, we have all of these different neighborhoods. These actually were their own little jurisdictions at one time before they were incorporated into the larger Portland. So Chinese people were driven out of places like Mount Tabor, Albina, Giles Lake, East Portland as well. So the new century. So let's talk about the early 1900s. So even though African-American people, Black Americans are not supposed to be, here in Oregon, we still see populations, so people, communities popping up throughout the state, mainly clustered near railroad stations. However, let's be clear that the tenor of the times, there was still a lynching of an African-American man, Alonzo Tucker, in Coos Bay, 1902. There was recently, just a couple years ago, a little monument memorial put up to honor honor his life, honor his time, mark the event that had happened. So, Oregon is still not a welcoming place. We see discrimination happening in public accommodations. Sundown laws also throughout the state. So sundown laws basically meant that people of color had to be out of town by the time the sun went down, or they could face legal consequences. These might actually be laws that are written on the books, or they might just be signs that are posted throughout the towns. Now, Oregon passed its own public accommodations law in the 50s. So this should no longer have been in practice after that. The Civil Rights Act nationally passed in 1964. So certainly sundown laws should not have been in effect. But we do know that in certain towns in Oregon, that into the early 1970s, these laws were still in practice. And I don't know about the rest of you, but that's actually not that long ago, the early 70s, right? So history is not really that far back when we're thinking about the impacts that it has today. And especially these things like violence, like sundown laws, that creates a real chilling effect. People are not going to feel safe in neighborhoods because of these things. In Salem, there was, an extremely strong African-American community in Salem. The first Black school was started in Salem, in Oregon. However, when these sundown laws took effect in Salem, the whole community left because they couldn't find that daily living was actually feasible with these kinds of laws. So these laws have a very chilling effect that lasts for generations. Also, let's get into the role of the real estate industry in the type of isolation, discrimination, segregation we see today. The Realtor Code of Ethics specifically said if a realtor sold a home to a Black person or Black family in an all-white neighborhood, they would lose their license. So the ramifications are very clear and very specific if somebody steps outside what is considered appropriate behavior. Also, there were restrictive covenants that were written into deeds of homes, which basically said only white people could live in the home or in the neighborhood. Sometimes people of color were allowed to live in the home, but only as a servant or as help. Now, these restrictive covenants are no longer legally enforceable. However, when we look at, this is nationwide, when we look at these communities that had these restrictive covenants in place, they are still predominantly white. They are still not mixed neighborhoods. There was also at the beginning of the century a national anti-immigrant sentiment. So focusing in again on the real estate industry. So the American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers ranked who was most favorable to be in neighborhoods, AKA who brought the most economic financial advantage to neighborhoods, who brought the most value. This is when we actually see the federal government putting a dollar amount on skin color. Let's be very clear, the federal government had a huge part in this. The real estate industry also supported it. So if we look at this list, who is higher on the list is considered to be more valuable for real estate, and the bottom of the list is less valuable. I would like to point out that Indigenous people aren't even on this list. So talk about erasing of identity. Now, one thing I find really interesting as well when we look at this list, Northern Italians are ranked as number 2. Southern Italians are ranked as number 8. What is the difference between Northern and Southern Italians? They come from the same area of the world. Well, Northern Italians are lighter complected, blonde hair, blue eyes. Southern Italians have darker skin, darker hair, darker eyes. They're considered less valuable than for a neighborhood. So then with the creation of the FHA, basically that created innovation during the Depression, and it changed access to home ownership and wealth accrual over time. So before the FHA was in place, people had to put 50% down on a home and only had 5 to 10 years to pay off the entire balance. Then with the creation of the FHA, we see the loan structure put in place that is still in place today. 20% down on your home, 30-year fixed rate mortgage. However, federal underwriting standards incorporated the de facto racist standards. So what do I mean by that? Basically, money was loaned out based on that list that's in the slide right before this one. That's how they decided who was going to get those home loans. So that created redlining. So the redlining of neighborhoods that were predominantly communities of color led to extreme racial inequities in FHA loans. Between 1934 and sorry, my little box of people is in the way, and 1962, of the $120 billion in loans, $120 billion, that is so much money, right? Of the $120 billion in loans made by the FHA, less than 2% of those loans went to non-whites, less than 2%. So we all in this room understand the importance of purchasing real estate to create economic advantage and just life opportunities, right? So what we see is the government very clearly not allowing all Americans equal opportunity around those things. We're going to change focus a little bit. So we're still going along on our timeline. So December 7th, 1941, what we see is the bombing of Pearl Harbor on that date. So let's talk a little bit about the Japanese experience in Oregon. Japanese farmers grew the majority of Oregon's produce. They were very prolific farmers, and they were brought in after that Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So you stop the Chinese from coming in, doing that difficult manual labor. Well, who's going to do it? Another group gets brought in. The Japanese then are brought in. There was a growing white resentment against these Japanese farmers, specifically because of how prolific they were, how successful they were. And then in 1923, the government passes what's called the Alien Land Law, which says nobody born outside of this country is allowed to purchase real estate. So this is where we start seeing Japanese people, Japanese farmers, Japanese Americans buying real estate in the names of their American-born children or in the names of neighbors. So again, let's think about if a community, an entire community, we want to financially disadvantage them, how do we do that? Block their access to real estate. And the government has done that systemically multiple times. There were 4,000 people, 4,000 Japanese people in Oregon, and the largest population was in Hood River because, of course, that's where agricultural was, like all the agriculture business was. And then came Executive Order 9066, which basically required the roundup of anybody who was of Japanese ancestry, whether American born or not, anybody who lived west of Highway 97. People were forced to gather at the Portland Assembly Center. So we now know that as the Portland Expo Center. But at the time, it was actually a livestock pavilion where farmers would come to sell livestock. They hastily renamed it the Assembly Center. They threw down plywood in the animal barns, and actually people were forced to live in animal barns at that time. You know, of course, there were chain link fences and barbed wire, armed guards. So this very much was a prison, but they named it the Portland Assembly Center, which is not an accurate name for what this place was. And people were forced into incarceration. 120,000 people lost their homes and farms. Think about how much money that is. 120,000 people lost their homes and farms. Of that, 2/3 were United States citizens. 2/3 were actually citizens of our country, wrongfully incarcerated. So let's talk about World War II and Black Americans. So in World War II, there were Black servicemen that enlisted because they basically, many of them wanted to show, like, I am an American, I am part of this country, I am also going to defend this country, because they wanted to rewrite the narrative of what it meant to be a Black American. However, Black American soldiers were not allowed to serve overseas. They were considered too much of a risk. They were forced to serve here stateside instead. We actually had a group of airmen. They were called the Triple Nickels, the 555th Airborne Battalion, and they were stationed in Eastern Oregon, in White City and in Pendleton. And they were treated in a discriminatory fashion by people in the city. So basically, these Black servicemen that are serving our country were not served in restaurants, were not served, in public accommodation areas like white Americans were, even though they were actively serving our country. Ultimately, the military put a stop to that disparate treatment. We also, during World War II, see a massive increase in the number of African-American people in Portland, specifically because Henry J. Kaiser's wartime shipyards needed workers, and he advertised nationwide for workers to come to these plants. So before the war, there were 2,000 African-American people that lived in Portland. And then 20,000 came to the Portland metro area to work in Henry J. Kaiser's wartime shipyards. However, Portland, of course, is redlined. So what does that mean? Black people and families are only allowed to live in very specific areas. So Albina was one area in Portland that Black Americans were allowed to live. Also Giles Lake Court Apartments, and also Vanport. Now, Vanport was actually a really integrated city in Oregon in a time where we were very segregated. It was the second largest city in all of Oregon. It was halfway between Vancouver and Portland. Ultimately, it was destroyed in a flood. But if you have a chance, go to Vanport Mosaic's website, and there are so many great oral histories of what it was like to live in Vanport as a child growing up. So let's talk about challenges that happened after the war. So after the war, there's an anti-Japanese sentiment, which is of course going to affect those people who are coming out of incarceration. So people trying to go back to Hood River to reclaim their farms, not being allowed to do that. The Oregon legislature, these people from incarceration after approximately, the average stay was 900 days, 900 days in incarceration. Many people trying to reintegrate into, towns that they had lived in were turned away from rentals or home loans. There are signs that would go up in business that would say, no Japs allowed. Homes were also burned to the ground in Lake LaBiche. So Lake LaBiche is right outside of Kaiser, Oregon. It was, a lot of agriculture was happening there. And so homes were actually burned to the ground. So Japanese and Japanese American farmers could not return to their homes. So not only systemic acts of the government, but also individual acts of hate and harassment from white community members. So for Black Americans, there were no jobs after the war. The unemployment rate for whites was around 8 to 10%. The unemployment rate for Black Americans was 50%. So basically, pressure started to build for Black Americans to leave Portland. And the pressure specifically was put on by local government who did things like cut people off from public benefits. The American Red Cross started to give out one-way tickets for people to leave town. This was also part of why the Urban League was created in Portland. It was really to help stoke job opportunities for Black Americans here in Portland. And then in 1948, Vanport floods. So that's that really relatively integrated community in our very segregated state. So when that flooded, what that meant was people had to find another place to live. And what we see happening specifically in the Albina neighborhood then is, people moving to Albina, and Albina having a population density 6 times higher than the rest of the city. And you can bet that the city was not upholding the infrastructure like, say, plumbing, electricity, those things to support that big of a population. So the beginning of change, we start seeing some change happen in the late 40s. So Shelley versus Kramer, this was a court case that was heard by the US Supreme Court, which they were deciding on restrictive covenants and should they be legally enforceable. Thurgood Marshall was an attorney on this case, of course, before he went on to be a Supreme Court judge. And it was decided that these deed restrictions would no longer be legally enforceable. However, with that said, there was also no teeth put into this if somebody were to still discriminate. So it does put a little bit of, a nick or a scratch in sort of the wall. It's the first Supreme Court decision that had to do with civil rights. So it does start to, crumble away some of this old institution or this old wall that's been created. However, again, there were no specific teeth put into this. In 1953, Oregon passes its own public accommodations law. So that means that public accommodations should no longer be discriminating. However, of course, we still see places with those sundown laws actively in practice. In 1959, Oregon also passes its own version of fair housing law, which means people should not be discriminated against in housing based on race, color, religion, national origin, those things. And yet, with those laws passing, realtors continue to segregate and steer to specific areas across the state, to specific areas within jurisdictions. Those sundown laws again continued into the 1960s, into the early 70s in some jurisdictions as well. Then in the 1960s, the National Civil Rights Movement. So we see the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. The initial Civil Rights Act passed in 1964. Housing was supposed to be included within the 1964 Civil Rights Act. However, even white Americans that were supportive of civil rights still wanted to maintain segregation in neighborhoods. If housing was included in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it never would have passed. So the housing portion was actually removed from the 64 Civil Rights Act so that the Civil Rights Act would pass. Then the Fair Housing Act floundered in committee for 4 more years, where the committee had, a very conservative politician from the South, had no desire for integration in housing. It basically floundered in committee for 4 years. So the Fair Housing Act actually becomes the most difficult piece of civil rights legislation to pass in the 1960s. Then what happens? What pushes it through that committee when it had floundered for 4 years? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April of 1968. There were riots in over 125 cities. Those riots created the political pressure to force the Fair Housing Act out of committee and have it put into law. So it was really interesting, I'll say, doing these presentations a few years ago when there were huge protests that were going on in Portland, because the reality of what we know when we look back historically is protests can create a lot of political pressure. It is the reason the Fair Housing Act was passed. And what the purpose of the act was, the Fair Housing Act was to address discrimination and segregation in housing. However, one thing that I'll say about this is there were no teeth put into the Fair Housing Act as far as, people couldn't recuperate damages from discrimination until 1988, the Fair Housing Amendments Act. That's when people could start recouping financial damages that happened because of discrimination. 1988 is not that long ago, right? It's not that long ago. So when we start looking at, the deck is stacked in the favor of very specific groups and definitely not others. So what are the fair housing issues that we hear about today? We hear about discrimination in rentals, sales, and loans. Primarily, we hear a lot about rental issues that are coming up as well. A lot of discrimination with HOAs, like that HOA president saying, don't sell this condo to anybody with a child or anybody with an assistance animal. HOAs do not understand that they also have to follow these laws and cannot discriminate. What we see also is that discrimination is oftentimes less overt, less obvious, but it's still pervasive, it's still happening. You may be aware of the court cases that are coming forward around discrimination and home appraisal, that people are getting their homes appraised, but they're appraising for far lower than they should. And then when people remove anything from the home that identifies that a Black person lives in the home, all of a sudden the home is appraising for much higher. Implicit bias, it might be implicit or it might be intentional bias that's happening, but we know this discrimination is still happening. If you haven't read about those cases, Google discrimination in home appraisals, you'll see it. Also, 50% of the contacts we get on our Fair Housing Hotline are specifically related to disability. People have the right to ask for reasonable accommodation when they're living with a disability, so an exception to a standard practice, policy, or procedure. So for example, I heard of a gentleman that had a condo in an HOA community. Guidelines specifically said no carpet or no hardwood floors, no linoleum, no pergo in these units, only carpet are allowed, except for he had really significant allergies to carpets. The HOA was trying not to budge to allow him to put a floor in based on his disability. Ultimately, he was successful in doing that because HOAs have to follow fair housing laws as well. We also know that harassment is on the rise. It's been on the rise since November of 2016. Also, we see gentrification. So what that means is, white people moving into neighborhoods that were traditionally communities of color or specifically communities of specific national origin. And then once white people move in, all of a sudden cities or jurisdictions starting to put a lot of money into the amenities, bike lanes, upgrades to parks, but not doing that earlier. So the fair housing perspective, what it is. Housing consumers should always have the choice of where to live based solely on their qualifications. And let's talk about perceptions versus intentions. Just like with negligence, ignorance is not a defense. So I didn't know this was a law. I didn't know that was illegal. That is actually not a defense at all. So that's why it's so important that you are here today getting education around fair housing. So if the discrimination happens on your property or in your firm, it is your business. It is your business. It is important to report, to take action, to do something. So let's walk through what some red flags might look like. It could be refusing to rent, sell, or finance, right? So that HOA president saying, don't sell this unit to those protected classes. It could be giving out false or inconsistent information. So one of the things that we see sometimes is realtors, not giving out the information about homes that people want in specific areas, right? Because the realtor assumes or steers that family to a specific zip code or says, because you're a person living with disability, no, I don't think you should live in this area of the town. I think you should live in that area of the town. Remember, people have the right to choose where to live regardless of their protected identity, and it should be based solely on their qualifications. Also, linguistic profiling. So if somebody has an accent, them not having calls returned because of that. Also, some other red flags. Think about discriminatory advertising, right? So watch out for phrases that might have a chilling effect. So this might be housing that's being sold in a senior retirement community, and it's advertised as active and healthy seniors wanted. Well, that would have a chilling effect on any seniors living with disabilities that affect mobility. Also think about what kinds of human models do you use in your advertisement? If you use only white, that's going to have a really clear chilling effect on communities of color, people of non-white national origins. Also thinking about where and how advertisements appear. Facebook got into a lot of trouble a few years ago because their algorithm about advertising housing would allow people that were doing the advertising to choose based on certain zip codes or certain, races, certain religions, those kinds of things, totally in violation of the Fair Housing Act. So what can you do? Be proactive. Display the HUD Fair Housing poster or the FHCO Fair Housing poster. The picture you see behind me, this was our poster contest winner a few years ago. If you have kiddos that are from ages, first grade up to 8th grade, we're doing our poster contest again. And the winner actually wins cash prizes, and we create it as a poster and reproduce it and send it out statewide. So if you've got kiddos, first grade to 8th grade, and you want to teach them about the importance of these laws and inclusive communities, this poster contest is a really great way to do that. Also, use the HUD Fair Housing and the Fair Housing lending logos, use them liberally, put them everywhere. Apply rules and criteria consistently when you're working with folks. Also, follow written policies and practices. And if you think that the policies and practices are questionable based on fair housing, wave a flag and say, we need to look at this. We need to get legal to look at this, specifically through a fair housing lens. So let's talk about just a few practice points. So this is a few more red flags that you might hear about. This is such a common question. What can you tell me about the buyer, right? The selling agent saying, what can you tell me about the buyer? Any response to this question that specifically shares protected identity, that's problematic from a fair housing perspective. So if it's like, oh, they're a family with kids, and then the person thinks, I don't want to sell to them because they're a family with kids, that's problematic under a fair housing lens. So what I've heard realtors say is, well, here's the offer, here's what they can put down, here's, the information, so it's like really sharing just about the qualifications. If they continue to push, you can always say, I went to a training around fair housing and I actually can't give you any information that discloses protected identity. That's illegal. Also, when you're thinking about this, not a bad idea to start creating written records if you start to feel that something is weird or something is going on. Those written records become very, very important if an organization like ours needs to step in and to help advocate. So any type of, written record, that could be emails, that could be texts, that could be things in writing, that could also be just conversations that you're having that you are logging, date, time, who's saying what, what's impacted, is there fair housing class, like a fair housing protected class that's in play there, writing all of that stuff down. Also, very questionable to be guessing ethnicity or race from names, because if that information is used and somehow sways the decision to sell, that's problematic from a fair housing perspective. Also, efforts to determine the protected class of a buyer in order to deny them housing, those must be avoided. So realtors of color also face discrimination. And I just want to point this out and be really clear about this. So discrimination can also be directed specifically at the realtor. So some realtors of colors intentionally leave their headshots off of promotional materials, or sometimes will also ask white colleagues to show homes. I'm certain you've probably heard at this point those situations where a prospective buyer of color has gone to look at a home and all of a sudden the police are called, or the realtor of color is taking the buyers to go look and the police are called, right? So the same types of issues that buyers can face around discrimination, those can also be aimed directly at the realtors. And that will affect the buying process. That will affect the housing. That will affect access to housing. So some more barriers. Realtors of color may also fear reprisals if they report. So I just want to say, if you are at a point where you are interested in reporting to us, regardless of your skin color, you're interested in reporting to us, we have several different ways or venues that somebody can report. And is it discrimination? Is it not? We can't say that initially. Our enforcement team has to actually talk to somebody, and there are some legal definition points that a situation needs to hit for it to be considered discrimination. However, what I say is, if you're in doubt, if you think it might be, go ahead and report it. We don't disclose. When somebody contacts us, we don't disclose. It's not like we're going to go back to your firm and say, so-and-so actually contacted us and said, ... Oftentimes that first call is just for information, right? It might be that you're just interested in getting some more information, maybe see what could apply to this situation. You may be calling because you're advocating for your client, right? That's really important to do. Also, realtors in general may face or may fear reprisals for advocating for fair housing. Online reviews, right? We had one realtor share with us that, getting an online review was really negatively impactful, and there was nothing that they could do to go back and change that review. So there's a fear of reprisals around advocating for fair housing. Others may also simply just not know how to report. So a really good first step, if you are interested in reporting, is to just contact our organization. We can't say right off the bat if it's discrimination, if it's not, but if there's questions that it might be, it is suggestible to contact us. Many also are afraid of reporting a colleague. But if we're afraid of reporting a colleague, then we're becoming complicit in that perpetuation of discrimination. That is also problematic. So let's talk about addressing discrimination. So first and foremost, increasing your knowledge and awareness. So good idea to have annual trainings around fair housing, right? Good idea to do that. So we're so glad that you come to this Fair Housing Summit that's happening. We hope that you're a repeat, that you're a repeat customer, that you came last year as well. Also, if your firm is doing annual trainings, oftentimes these title companies will cover fair housing trainings. We come in and do these trainings for realtor firms often. So include training within a fair housing training to protect the safety of realtors of color. So do an add-on as an organization. It's important also to stay rooted in the positivity of this work and why we do this work, right? Why is it important for, equitable housing? Studies have shown that integrated neighborhoods are actually better for property value. Also, it's important to acknowledge the personal impact and the professional and societal need for reporting, right? So that we're no longer maintaining these systems of oppression that have been created. Also, let's talk about how to report now. So contact us. If you think something might be discrimination, you're not sure. Again, we can't say right off the bat if it is or not, but somebody can talk to one of our enforcement advocates and walk through that situation to figure out, does this sound like housing discrimination? Does it not sound like housing discrimination? There's a few different ways you can contact us. One, email housingprovider@fhco.org. We consider that realtors are actually part of the housing provider family because you are helping people get connected with permanent, stable housing. Hopefully stable, right? We don't 100% know if people are going to stay stable, but hopefully stable. Then also you can email us at information@fhco.org. Or if you just want more information about fair housing in general, go to our website, fhco.org. We have a really fantastic virtual library with the follow-up email that's going to be sent out with this presentation, this chunk of the presentation. There's going to be resources like a one-pager for what housing discrimination looks like in home buying. We would hope you would consider putting that in your new home buyer packets. Also, we have a book about housing discrimination, like a whole guidebook around housing discrimination in the home buying process, so people can start to identify, is discrimination happening or is it not? So with that, I am wrapping up at the end of my presentation, but I would love it if you took a second and filled out a very quick survey just to talk about what you thought of this portion of presentation. It's actually, this presentation was funded through a grant from Oregon Housing and Community Services. So they really want to hear about what you thought of the presentation. It's like 4 questions, 5 questions, very quick. Please take a moment, fill that out. Latasha, I'll give you the microphone.
Thank you so much, Shyle. Tough conversation, very sobering as you were going through that. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Shyle is a force in the fair housing space. Keep Fair Housing Council of Oregon as a resource in your back pocket. I know there were a couple of questions in the chat. We did get those. I'll try to see if we can wrap those into what we send out at the end. We're going to take a quick break and then hear from Richard and Leah at 10 a.m. Before you stretch and refill your coffee, though, can you take a moment to reflect on your biggest takeaway or aha moment from Shyle's presentation? If you're comfortable, drop it in the chat, and we'll see you at 10 o'clock.
Hmm.
All right, welcome back. Thank you for all your ahas in the chat. Loved reading through those. Next, we're joined by Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America in last year's keynote, and Leah Rothstein, housing policy expert. They've written a new book, Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law, which will be hitting bookshelves this summer. For those of you who have not yet had a chance to read it, in The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein argues with exacting precision and fascinating insight how segregation in America, the incessant kind that continues to dog our major cities and has contributed to so much recent social strife, is the byproduct of explicit government policies at the local, state, and federal level. A former columnist for the New York Times and a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute, as well as a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Rothstein has spent years documenting the evidence that government not merely ignored discriminatory practices in the residential sphere, but promoted them. The impact has been devastating for generations of African Americans who were denied the right to live where they wanted to live and raise and school their children where they thought best. While the Fair Housing Act in 1968 provided modest enforcement to prevent future discrimination, it did nothing to reverse or undo a century's worth of state-sanctioned violations of the Bill of Rights, particularly the 13th Amendment, which banned treating formerly enslaved people as second-class citizens. So the structural conditions established by the 20th century federal policy endure to this day. At every step of the way, Rothstein demonstrates the government and our courts upheld racist policies to maintain the separation of whites and blacks, leading to the powder keg, which has defined Ferguson, Baltimore, Charleston, and Chicago. The Color of Law is not a tale of red versus blue states. It is sadly the story of America in all of its municipalities, large and small, liberal and reactionary. Please mute if you have an opportunity to do so. In the 6 years since its initial publication, The Color of Law, the most forceful argument ever published on how federal, state, and local governments gave rise to and reinforced neighborhood segregation, has become a landmark work, which through its nearly 1 million copies sold, has helped to define the fractious age in which we live. Aware that the 21st century segregation continues to promote entrenched inequality, Richard Rothstein has now teamed with housing policy expert Leah Rothstein to write Just Action, a blueprint for concerned citizens and community leaders. This book describes dozens of activities that readers and supporters can undertake in their own communities to make their commitment real, producing victories that might finally challenge residential segregation and help remedy America's profoundly unconstitutional past. Leah Rothstein's expertise in the full range of housing policy stems from more than 2 decades of experience as a consultant to affordable housing developers and local governments, and as a community and union organizer. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Please join me in welcoming Richard Rothstein and Leah Rothstein.
Well, thank you, Natasha. You don't really need me. You've got it all. And congratulations to all of you for persisting through this, was it a blizzard or storm, to participate in this event today. I'm worried that we wouldn't be able to proceed with it when I read about what you've been going through. Anyhow, you know, as Latasha just described, The Color of Law, my previous book, demolishes the national myth of de facto segregation. It's something a term we all use, something we all believe or believed, that the reason that we're segregated in every metropolitan area in this country is not for any reason other than private discrimination. Private realtors, bankers, developers, insurance companies discriminated against African Americans when they created new housing or sold housing. Homeowners landlords refused in their private capacity to sell or rent their homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. People just like to live with each other, we tell ourselves, of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way, and that's why we're segregated. Or maybe it's just because of income differences. On average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, and so many African Americans can't afford to move to white neighborhoods, and that's why we're so segregated. All of these individual, bigoted, discriminatory actions, self-choice, economic differences. This is what's created segregation. It wasn't government that did it. It was just private activity. And when we have de facto segregation like this, something that wasn't created by government, that just happened by accident, what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. That was a widespread, commonplace belief. I shared it before I did the research that led to the color of law. And I'm sure many of you use this de facto term as well. Well, what I discovered when I began the research to write the color of law is that this is an utter myth. There's no basis in reality to it whatsoever. Of course, there was private discrimination. Of course, the real estate industry would not permit African Americans to move to white neighborhoods in the 20th century. But this private discrimination could not have persisted, could not have existed, were it not required by government. Had government required the opposite, discriminatory in intent or not, realtors wouldn't have been able to discriminate. So I began this research because I was a housing policy expert, an education policy expert, excuse me. And in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that concerned two school districts. One was Louisville, Kentucky, the other was Seattle, Washington. Both of these districts had enacted a very trivial school desegregation plan. They gave parents the choice of which school their child would attend, but if the choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice would not be honored in favor of the choice of a parent who wouldn't do so. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, both a black and a white child applied for one of the last remaining places, the black child would be given some preference, help to desegregate the school. It was a very trivial program. You don't have one place left very often, and you have to choose between a black and a white applicant. But the Supreme Court evaluated this decision, this policy. They denounced it, said it was unconstitutional, said you couldn't do such a thing. Chief Justice John Roberts read the decision, wrote the decision. He said that the reason you couldn't do it is because the neighborhoods in Louisville and Seattle that produced those segregated schools were segregated de facto, without government participation, all because of private bigotry and self-choice and economic differences. And he said, well, you have this kind of de facto segregation that wasn't created by government. Government is prohibited from doing anything about it. Well, I read this decision back in 2007. I remembered reading about something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, one of those two school districts, some years before. In Louisville, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in an all-white suburb called Shively. That white homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. That African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife, a child. He wanted to move to a single-family home, but no realtor would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in his all-white community and sold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of nearby residents surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. The police made no effort to stop that either. But when the riot was all over, the white homeowner was arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year jail sentence for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the courts, the prosecutors, the entire criminal justice system was mobilized to prevent African Americans from living near whites. Well, I began to look into it further, and I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of cases like this all across the country, on the West Coast, in the Midwest, in the Northeast, in the central states, and in the Southeast. Hundreds of cases like this of mob violence protected by the police, sometimes even organized and led by the police, designed to keep African Americans and whites separate. Every one of these actions was unconstitutional. The police are state agents. They represent our government. And when the police are enforcing segregation, that's not private discrimination. That's in effect an action of the state. It's unconstitutional, and it requires us to remedy it. As American citizens, we're required, if we uphold the Constitution, to remedy constitutional violations. But the Louisville segregation that was created by police in this instance was never remedied, and neither was any of the other hundreds and hundreds of cases of police-sponsored mob violence remedied. Well, I began to look into it further, and I found that it was not just state-sponsored violence that created the segregation that we know today in every metropolitan area, but there were many, many federal, state, and local policies designed to ensure that blacks and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area. Every one of these policies was unconstitutional. Every one of them requires a remedy, which we have never faced up to the obligation to enact. Let me describe one of the more powerful ones. I described before that suburb of Shively, that all-white suburb of single-family homes outside Louisville. The suburbanization of this country was accomplished primarily in the post-World War II period by two federal agencies, the Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration. It was designed to move the entire working class, middle class white population out of single-family homes, out of urban areas rather, where they were living in apartments, and into single-family homes in all-white suburbs. African Americans were prohibited by these federal agencies from participating in this program. At that time, we were an urban country. There were very few people living in suburbs, except for the affluent, and single-family homes in the suburbs, except for the affluent. So the federal program is designed to move the whites out of those urban areas. The Federal Housing Administration subsidized builders to create these subdivisions. The most famous of them, I wrote this extensively in The Color of Law, is one across the country from you, Levittown, east of New York City. You've probably heard of it. 17,000 homes in one place, east of New York. Levitt, the builder of Levittown, could never have afforded to build it on his own. He could never have assembled the capital to buy the land or build the housing, 17,000 of them. The only way he could go ahead was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations, submitting his plans for the development. Those plans had to include the architectural design of the homes, very detailed, the layout of the streets, and he had to make a commitment to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations that he would never sell a home to an African American. Now, as I said, this doesn't mean that Levitt wasn't bigoted. He was. Left to his own devices, he would never have sold a home to an African American. But if the federal government had followed its constitutional responsibilities and told Levitt, we'll guarantee your bank loans only if you sell homes on a non-discriminatory basis, bigoted or not, he would have had to do so. And we would have a segregated country today because suburbs all over this country were created in this fashion by the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations at that time. In Portland and Seattle and Los Angeles and San Francisco and throughout the rest of the country. That's how we came to be suburbanized. Well, the white families who bought these homes at that time paid, in today's money, about $100,000 for them. They were modest homes. Those homes, as you know, no longer sell for $100,000. In some parts of the country, they sell for $1 million or more. $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 is the lowest they sell for. The white families who were subsidized by the federal government, both with FHA and VA loans and with the subsidy to the developer of their bank guarantees to build the projects, those white families gained wealth over the next couple of generations as the value of their homes appreciated from $100,000 to $200,000, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 or $1 million. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies like short-term unemployment or a medical issue. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this program that wound up generating wealth. The result is that today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white average incomes. That's a disparity. There's another whole story behind that, but at the very least, you'd think that if African American incomes were 60% of white incomes, African American wealth would also be 60% of white wealth. You can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, while African American incomes average 60% of white incomes, African American wealth averages about 5% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century and that's never been remedied. These policies of the FHA and VA were not the actions of rogue bureaucrats. They were written out in the federal policy manual that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of developers to build these single-family home developments. The manual said that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who is going to sell to African Americans. The written manual also said you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee the loan to a developer of a white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, the written federal policy manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. As I said, this notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. And this particular policy that generated an enormous wealth gap that largely contributes and is responsible for the ongoing segregation that we have today, where young African American families don't have wealth to inherit from their parents, who were not permitted to buy homes that were going to appreciate in value. So it's the single biggest factor that predicts the ongoing segregation that we have today, and it imposes on all of us, because of its unconstitutional character, an obligation to remedy, and it's an obligation that we have never accepted. The real estate industry has done a good job of perhaps trying to eliminate ongoing discrimination, but we need to face up to the obligation as well to undo the effects of past discrimination, which simply eliminating ongoing discrimination won't do. It's one thing to pass a Fair Housing Act and tell Black families, okay, you can now move into places like Levittown, but Levittown is no longer affordable to working and middle-class families of any race. It requires a remedy. Well, there were many, many other policies that the federal government and local and state governments followed to impose segregation on this country. I'll mention just one other. Public housing. The first public housing in this country was not built for poor people. It was built during the Depression in the 1930s by the Roosevelt administration at a time when there was a housing shortage because there was no housing construction going on. The federal government built the first housing in the New Deal, first public housing. It was for whites and Blacks separately. In most places, it was for whites alone. There were many more white projects built than Black projects. These were for working middle-class families that could afford housing, but there was no housing available because of the housing shortage. The federal government segregated it everywhere it built it. It was the first time the federal government was ever involved in the housing industry. It was the 1930s. Sometimes they segregated neighborhoods that were previously integrated. There was much more integration in those days than there is today in downtown areas. The reason was that I told you that most working and middle-class families lived in urban downtown areas. It was a manufacturing economy. That's where the factories were located. That's where the banks were located. The federal government, as I say, frequently segregated these neighborhoods that hadn't previously been segregated. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright, Langston Hughes, wrote in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. That's not how we think of downtown Cleveland today, as an integrated area. He said his best friend in high school was Polish. He said he dated a Jewish girl. It was a local high school in an integrated neighborhood. The high school was integrated. The Public Works Administration, the first New Deal agency, went into that area of Cleveland and built 2 separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and then with other projects elsewhere in Cleveland, reinforced that segregation. On the West Coast, that's how the West Coast came to be segregated, with public federal housing for war workers during World War II. As you may know from the history of the migration of African Americans from the former slaveholding states into the rest of the country, the great migration of African Americans to the West Coast, places like Seattle and Portland and San Francisco and Los Angeles, didn't take place until World War II, because there was shipbuilding and aircraft industries on the West Coast that needed more workers than those cities could supply, than your cities could supply. If the federal government wanted the planes and the ships and the tanks and the jeeps to be produced, it had to provide housing for these war workers, hundreds of thousands, white and black, who moved to the centers of war production, and it did. Everywhere it built housing, it built it on a segregated basis, separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, creating segregation in many parts of the country where it hadn't previously existed. In the San Francisco Bay Area, where Leah and I are from, in San Francisco itself, the federal government built 5 projects for war workers, 4 for whites only, 1 for African Americans, creating segregation in San Francisco where it hadn't previously existed. Well, I wrote this book. It, as Natasha said, it got a lot of attention, and many readers came to me and said, well, what can we do about it now? Well, I didn't know. So I recruited a housing policy expert to help me figure it out. She happened to be someone I know very well, my daughter. I persuaded her to quit her job and work with me to answer this important question. We produced a new book called Just Action, which focuses on what every one of us can do in our local communities to redress the unconstitutional segregation that we've created. And the book will be out on June 1st, as Latasha said. And I'm going to turn this over now to Leah to talk about some of the things that we describe all of us can do in response to this unconstitutional apartheid system that we've created. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having us. Nice to be here with you all. So, as my dad mentioned, a lot of people, including myself, who read The Color of Law, came to him and asked, what do we do about it now? We live in this entrenched, segregated society. We see how the past actions of our government created it, but it doesn't give us a lot of direction in how to address it and redress segregation now in our own communities. So we wrote this book, Just Action, to answer that question. And we recognize that in order to redress segregation around the country, we will need massive federal interventions and investments. And there isn't the federal political will right now to do that, but there's a lot that can be done in our own communities, a lot that we can do locally to redress segregation in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities. So that's what we focus on in Just Action. And we argue that to do that, to start these local movements to redress segregation, to challenge segregation, we need to build an activist civil rights movement across the country that starts locally and together bubbles up to a national movement at some point in the future. But to start locally, how do we do that? How do we build this activist civil rights movement in our own communities? Well, we can begin by building biracial, multi-ethnic groups in our own neighborhoods to start talking about these issues. This itself might feel daunting. These days, we have little cross-race contact outside of the workplace, in large part because we live in very racially segregated communities, as we know. But it's not impossible. In Just Action, we give some examples of communities that people who live in segregated communities and bridge those divides to come together and learn about their common interests and desires for their communities and started working together to talk about these issues. So once a group like that forms, it can start by learning about the history, like what we're talking about now, about how the history of how the government segregated and how your own community segregated. We give a couple of examples in Just Action: Modesto, California, Rochester, New York, Charlottesville, Virginia. In all of those communities, these groups started forming and talking about segregation when homeowners discovered racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of their own homes. As my dad mentioned, this was a primary tool of the federal government in the 20th century to create segregation. These are the covenants that say that this home can never be sold or owned or occupied by anybody other than people of the white race. So as we know, these are no longer legally enforceable covenants, but they remain on the deeds of homes forever. And when people discover these on their own, the deeds of their own homes, they were shocked. They, shocked to see how intentionally their own community, their own home, their own block was segregated. And they started to investigate and create inventories and maps of their communities where the restrictive covenants existed, who was behind them, who was written into the deeds when the home was built, the builders, the realtors, the banks that financed the home building. And they started to create educational campaigns and educate their neighbors and colleagues around their communities. And it raises awareness and inspires people to action, because as my dad said, once we recognize that this isn't just something that happened naturally, that it was intentional action that created segregation in our communities, we can begin to understand that intentional action can do something to challenge it and to redress it. So as we mentioned, Just Action, we focus on local strategies that a local group like this could take on to redress segregation. And these strategies both focus on what we can do to challenge segregation going forward, so we don't continue to create and maintain neighborhoods that are racially segregated, and also do something to redress the harms of the past. As my dad mentioned, because of past government actions, we now live in a very economically unequal society by race, and we have to do something to redress the harms that the government's past actions caused in order to create a more equal society now. So when we talk about in Just Action the dozens and dozens of strategies and policies and actions that a local group can take on and advocate for, we categorize them into two main categories. One is the strategies that we can pursue that will increase investment and resources in lower income segregated communities, where the concentration of poverty is the direct result of government-sponsored segregation. These strategies also include anti-displacement strategies, so that as we begin to increase the resources in these lower income communities, we don't displace the people who've lived there for a long time. These anti-displacement strategies include rent control policies, just cause eviction policies, inclusionary zoning, which requires that when new market rate housing is built in a neighborhood, a certain percentage of the units in that development have to be reserved for lower and moderate income households. That's a way you can ensure that as investment increases in a neighborhood, there's still some opportunity for lower and moderate income households to remain. One strategy that I'm going to just go into a little more detail on is starting or expanding a land trust. So there's about 200 communities around the country that have land trusts. And what land trusts do is they attempt to maintain affordable housing in a community as prices there start to rise. And a community is maybe experiencing gentrification or increased investment. And they can maintain affordable housing opportunities forever in perpetuity, while also providing homeownership opportunities for low and moderate income households. Those are two big goals. So how does a land trust accomplish both of those things? Well, it starts by acquiring property. And often this is through a local government that has vacant land that it's not using and can donate that land to a land trust to use to create housing opportunities. Now, often a local government won't just give over land to a land trust. It takes a local committee and advocates pushing a local government to do that. So this is another place where those who support the redress of segregation can focus their efforts. So a land trust will get the property, it will build or rehabilitate homes on that property, and then sells the homes to lower moderate income families at an affordable price. And it can do this because the land trust retains ownership of the land underneath the house. And it maybe leases that land to the family that buys the house for maybe $1 a year. And by retaining ownership of the land under the house, it can keep the home price affordable, because the increased value of land is one of the biggest drivers of the increasing unaffordability of housing. So it retains ownership of the land, sells the home at an affordable price to a lower moderate income family who owns the home like any other family would. But when they come time to sell the house, if they want to move on, move to a different neighborhood, whatever their reasons for selling, they have an agreement with the land trust that they will adhere to a formula that the land trust establishes that determines the maximum sales price that they can resell their home for. And that sales price, it balances the desire to build up some equity for that home selling family, along with balancing that with the need to keep the sales price affordable for the next buying family. So it's a balance that every land trust strikes slightly differently. They have different formulas, ways of determining this, but they all try to meet these two goals. An example we give in Just Action is in Durham, North Carolina. The Durham Land Trust was started when neighbors in the Birch Avenue neighborhood of Durham started organizing for things that were important to them. And they started by organizing to get the city to turn a vacant lot into a park because there was no safe place for children to play in their neighborhood. A child was hit by a car, and that galvanized the neighborhood to start, advocating for this park. And the city, they won. The city turned a vacant lot into a park, and the group was excited and inspired and looking around to see what else they could do to help their neighborhood. And they started learning about land trusts. Now, at the time, their neighborhood was gentrifying. It's near Duke University. The university was expanding and increasing enrollment, and investors saw an opportunity, and they were buying up homes in this lower income neighborhood and selling and renting them to the Duke University community students and faculty, and threatening to displace a lot of the lower income African-American residents of this neighborhood. So the residents, they started the Durham Land Trust. They started with 2 vacant homes. The first buyers paid about $100,000 in today's money, pretty affordable price for a home. And now, and more affordable than homes were selling for at the time. Now, because of that formula I mentioned, homes are slightly less affordable. They now sell for about $150,000, but it's far more affordable than the homes in the neighborhood that are now selling for about $500,000. So we can see that a land trust in this neighborhood and elsewhere around the country can be an effective anti-displacement strategy. It helped, you can see in this neighborhood, the blocks where the land trust was able to acquire homes and sell or rent them at affordable prices. Most of the residents are still African-American, while in the surrounding blocks where the land trust wasn't able to outpace the investors, most of the residents are now white. So it was an effective anti-displacement strategy for those blocks where it could acquire homes, and also an effective home ownership strategy for those residents. So what can we do with this information? Well, individually, we can donate or volunteer with a land trust if there is one in our community, or help get one started if there isn't one. But more importantly, what we can do is join together to join or support a campaign to make sure that local land trusts have the funding and the resources they need to continue to operate and expand. And as I said, this includes advocating that the government donate local unused land, vacant land that it may own to a land trust, maybe identifying the institutions in your community that help to segregate the community and pressuring them to participate in remedying the segregation that they caused by supporting a local land trust. So that's a strategy that is focused on increasing investment in lower income communities. And the other category of strategies we talk about are concerned with opening up exclusive white neighborhoods to diverse residents. These strategies include things like zoning changes, like Oregon has done, ending single family zoning, subsidies for African Americans to move into expensive communities, inclusionary zoning again. These strategies also include those that protect the integration of a community as it starts to diversify to prevent white flight and maintain a stable integration of that neighborhood. So one strategy that falls into this category involves Section 8. We've all probably heard of the Section 8 program. It's the largest federal rental subsidy program in the country. It's a housing voucher that lower income families can receive, funded by the federal government, administered by local public housing authorities. Over 2 million low-income households around the country receive Section 8 vouchers. They're disproportionately African American. There's over 4 million more that are eligible, and there isn't enough funding for them to receive a voucher. That's another story for another time, but still 2 million is a lot of people receiving this benefit. So when someone receives a Section 8 voucher benefit, It's unlike public housing where the benefit comes in with a unit in a specific place in a building, right? The Section 8 voucher can be used anywhere in the private market in that housing authority's jurisdiction. Now, most of us want to live in neighborhoods with low crime, with well-resourced schools, access to open space and jobs and transportation. We call these areas of high opportunity, and children who live in these areas do better. They have better education outcomes, health outcomes, income outcomes as adults. Their parents experience less stress and depression. This is why we call these areas high opportunity areas. But high opportunity are also often high cost areas, and they're designed to keep lower income people out because they're too expensive for them to afford to live there. Well, Section 8 has the potential and had the intent when it was created to address this by allowing lower income people to be able to afford to live in higher cost areas. But only 5% of Section 8 voucher holders live in areas of high opportunity around the country, and whites are more likely to than African Americans. One reason for this is discrimination, plain and simple. The federal government allows discrimination against people who use a voucher to pay their rent. It's allowed by the federal government, but many states and localities have passed laws called source of income discrimination laws that outlaw this type of discrimination. Oregon has one of these laws, so it's illegal in Oregon to discriminate against a tenant who uses Section 8 to pay their rent. But even with the law, discrimination is still common. It still happens, even in places with a source of income discrimination law. And that's because often these laws don't have a lot of teeth. The enforcement is minimal. And it still takes education and monitoring and, again, enforcement to ensure that a law that's passed is adhered to by landlords. So often this work falls to fair housing organizations to do this education and monitoring and enforcement. And these organizations need our support. So another way that a local group organized to redress segregation could participate is by supporting a fair housing organization and making sure it has the resources it needs. Again, a local government could support it, and the institutions who contributed to creating segregation could participate in a remedy by supporting a fair housing organization. Another thing we could do individually is to participate with a fair housing organization and volunteer as a tester. And you all are probably familiar with paired testing programs, but for Section 8 discrimination, what a fair housing organization would do is send potential tenants to a landlord, some white, some African American with similar characteristics and financial background. And some might say that you use Section 8 and some don't. And depending on how they're treated by the landlord and who's offered an apartment and who isn't, or a house and who isn't, that's how you can tease out where discrimination is occurring. And fair housing organizations, they need volunteers to do this. They don't have the funding to pay people to serve as testers. And so that's another way we can support this work. So that's discrimination, but the voucher amount itself is also an obstacle to voucher holders moving to high opportunity areas. So the way the voucher works is when someone receives a Section 8 voucher, they pay 30% of their income, monthly income towards their rent, and the voucher makes up the difference, up to a maximum amount set by the federal government and the local public housing authorities. Now that maximum amount is based on the whole metropolitan area's median rent. So you take an entire metropolitan area, which usually has a large range of rents, you take the rent right in the middle of that range, go 10% below that, and that's the maximum amount a voucher will pay towards rent. So by definition, over half of the rents in a metropolitan area are unaffordable to voucher holders. Obviously, those are likely to be the units in high opportunity, higher cost areas. So in 2010, there was a lawsuit in Dallas that alleged that this voucher payment standard caused the segregation and isolation of African American and Hispanic families into high poverty areas. And as a result of this lawsuit, the housing authorities in the Dallas area adopted what's called a small area fair market rent standard. So instead of taking the median rent of the entire metropolitan area, they take a smaller area, a zip code or a group of zip codes, and use the median rent of that smaller area to determine how much a voucher would pay for rent in that area. So as a result, vouchers can pay a higher rent in higher cost areas and lower rent and lower cost areas, which makes sense. And as a result, voucher holders in the Dallas area had the ability, more mobility. They could move to higher opportunity, higher cost areas easier after this change was made. So after that, now HUD requires 180 housing authorities in 24 metropolitan areas around the country to use these small area rent standards. None of the housing authorities or metro areas in Oregon are currently required to, but any local housing authority can voluntarily adopt a small area rent standard. And that's another thing that a local group organized to redress segregation could advocate, that their local housing authority look into adopting these small area rent standards to allow voucher holders to move to higher cost areas. In other places, housing authorities and housing advocates have adopted comprehensive mobility programs to help support voucher holders to move to higher opportunity areas. These programs usually include counselors. They help the recipients to find and apply for units in higher cost areas, might help them with transportation to get there. They also usually have staff devoted to recruiting landlords in these higher opportunity areas to agree to rent to voucher holders. And they usually offer financial assistance to the participants to help them pay for higher security deposits, rental application fees, as I said, transportation and moving expenses. So Milwaukee has a program like this that we've been following, has all of these components. It's funded by a foundation. It's being studied by a social research firm to see how it works. It has all of these components, but it's not being very successful. There's only a few of their participants who've been able to move to higher opportunity areas. And that's because in Milwaukee, the Milwaukee City Housing Authority only uses the small area rent standard in a handful of zip codes. The suburban areas around Milwaukee do not. Only the city of Milwaukee has a source of income discrimination law. The suburbs don't. And even in Milwaukee, it's not well enforced. So this program, with all of the funding it has to support mobility moves, it's not operating in the context that allows it to be successful. So it's another example of where an organized group could help. It could help ensure that the Milwaukee Housing Authority and the suburban ones adopt a small area rent standard, that they adopt anti-discrimination laws and help ensure that they're enforced. So another way that we can help open up these exclusive white communities to diverse residents. Now, going back for a second to the land trust example, I use that as an example of increasing investments in lower income communities. It can also be used as a strategy to open up exclusive whiter communities to diverse residents. And that would be, so it's often used in lower income communities, land trust, because that's where they can afford to acquire land to build and then or rehabilitate houses. But if a land trust could acquire land in a more expensive suburb, it would be an excellent opportunity to increase housing opportunities there for lower income families and to open up those communities to people who've been historically excluded from them. And there's opportunities for this. Many suburbs have vacant land that could be donated to a land trust if there were advocates in those suburban communities pushing their government to do so. In Just Action, we talk about a couple of examples. In Woodbridge, Connecticut, the town acquired an unused country club that they're trying to decide what to do with. In Modesto, California, similar, an unused golf course. So there is vacant land in these suburbs that could be donated to land trusts to do this important work. Also, many suburban communities around the country are having a decreasing public school enrollment and have vacant public school sites that could be donated to land trusts who could then build homes and help diversify and open up those exclusive communities. So I hope as I talk about these examples, what's coming across is that there's not nothing that can be done to redress segregation. These are just a few examples. Just Action has many, many, many more, and there's a lot more we couldn't include in the book. And the main message we hope comes across is that there's not nothing that can be done. There's always something, and it depends on your community and what the history is, what the current climate is, what people are interested in doing, but there's always something that can be done. So really quickly, I'll just also give a couple more examples. I talk about the main categories of investing in lower income communities and opening up exclusive communities to diversity. But there's also some strategies that span both of these goals. And those include things like increasing home ownership opportunities for African-American households through things like down payment assistance programs, homeownership counseling, and providing subsidies to help make homes affordable to these families who were excluded from homeownership when homes were more affordable for everybody. So we talked about the obvious ways African Americans have been denied homeownership through racially restrictive covenants and examples like that, but there's less obvious ways that are still acting that keep African Americans from homeownership. And one of those is the credit scoring system that we currently use throughout the country. We're all probably familiar with credit scores. It's supposed to be an objective rating of our future ability to repay a loan or a mortgage based on our financial history, which makes some sense. If I've defaulted on a loan in the past, I might be more likely to default in the future, and maybe a lender should know that. But credit score is only based on a certain type of financial history, and it's the type of financial history that whites are more likely to have than African Americans. For all the reasons we've mentioned, African Americans are more likely to have been renters their whole lives than whites. And no matter how faithfully they've paid their rent their whole lives, that faithful payment of rent or utility bills or any other bills that they maybe never missed a payment on, it doesn't provide a benefit in their credit score to tell a lender that they would be a good candidate for a mortgage. So that's a way a lot of African Americans are blocked from getting a good mortgage or getting approved for any mortgage. And there's no reason, aside from it taking a little more work on the part of credit scoring agencies or banks, that this kind of financial history couldn't be included in a credit scoring algorithm. And there are movements around the country to change the credit scoring system to include rental payment history more consistently. But while we wait for that to happen, we can do that. We can push for our local banks and credit unions to take this into account in their own algorithms for credit scoring of their mortgage applicants. And this would go a long way in opening up homeownership opportunities for African American homebuyers. And that's something a local group could do as well. They could pressure their local banks and credit unions to start to do this, and some have around the country. So I'll just wrap up by saying that if you get into the weeds of this conversation amongst like policy wonks and housing policy experts, you'll see that there's a debate that some people say we should be focusing all of our efforts on increasing investments in lower income African American communities. And some say, no, we should focus all of our efforts on opening up exclusive white communities to African American residents. And we say, we believe that we have so far to go and so much that needs changing that we can't afford to be choosy. It's not a either or option. We need all of these strategies to be successful and to redress segregation around the country. And we'll need them all eventually, and they'll all help get us where we want to go. We just need to get started. And so we hope that our book that's coming out and our talk today helps inspire some ideas or thoughts about how to get started on these topics in your own community. And I believe we have a few minutes for questions now.
Wow, fantastic. I was writing as fast as I could write. Those are some great suggestions, and I cannot wait for the book. If you have a burning question, drop it in the chat now for me. But some of us might be feeling a little discouraged after learning of the work we have ahead. How optimistic are you that real change is possible when it comes to dismantling segregation in our country?
Well, I'm very optimistic. I'm very optimistic because so long as we thought it happened by accident, it was very hard to figure out what to do about it. Once we understand it was created by purposeful government policy, the solutions are obvious. And the obligations to enact those solutions are obvious. Now, it requires, as Leah described, the organization of a new civil rights movement in local communities. But so long as we thought it was accidental, it was very hard what we could do. So I am optimistic.
I love
and
that.
I'd add that in almost every example of a policy or strategy a local group could take on that we talk about in Just Action and that we research, there's an example of a community doing that, trying it and being successful. And so this is happening all over the country. And it's, you know, it's just like learning about this history is like peeling an onion and getting through all the layers. It's not just, you know, banks, it's not just credit scoring, it's appraisal, you know, all of the pieces of the puzzle. It's the same thing to undo it, right? So every community, there's something happening in so many communities around the country to challenge segregation and to begin to redress it, that it does feel optimistic to start to learn about that and see what's happening.
I love that. And I love that you said there's always something that can be done. I think sometimes we get overwhelmed because we want to go big or go home, but it's really in those small things that things get done. It's persistent small steps that take us to the big actions that we want to see. I am so thankful to have had you both here today. And so we just appreciate being able to spend this time with you. So thank you so much for spending some time with us. And I'm sure you guys all are blowing up the chat with how thankful you are for their amazing insights. They had some amazing, powerful insights to share. And so we're going to be discussing some of these points that they brought up and other takeaways from today's summit in our next Oregon Realtors Diversity Key Committee meeting during spring governance. It's bright and early at 8 a.m. on April 6th. So grab your phone and get your calendar out. April 6th at 8 a.m. This will be available in person or virtually, so you can pick either when you register. So we hope you're able to wake up early and prioritize attending, so we can have some real discussion about how the Oregon Realtors Diversity Key Committee can get involved in some of this work. So the link to register will be included in our follow-up email. The first 100 attendees to complete the Fair Housing Summit feedback form that will be posted in the chat at the end of the summit, so stay tuned. The first 100 attendees to complete the Fair Housing Summit feedback form that will be emailed after this event will receive a copy of their new book, Just Action. You'll also be able to sign up for the Diversity Key Committee's book club, which first we're going to be covering inclusion on purpose. And then we're going to start Just Action in the fall. We want to make sure everyone gets a copy of the book before we get that book club started. And so we're really looking forward to that. Again, the Fair Housing Summit feedback form will be posted in the chat at the end of the summit and emailed to attendees, and the first 100 to complete it will be able to get that book. So we are going to break again. Please take a moment to reflect on your biggest takeaways or ahas. I know some of you have already done that from Richard and Leah's presentation, thanking them. And we'll see you back at 11 for an update from our Oregon Realtors Government Affair Key Committee. Thank you again, Richard and Leah. You guys are awesome. We appreciate all the work and research you've done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a quick note, I will reach out to Richard and Leah and find out if that book is going to be available in audio format. The Color of Law was in audio. So I assume that Just Action will be as well, but I will reach out and confirm that and send a follow-up on that.
Leah did drop in the chat that it will be available on Audible, sorry.
Fantastic. Thank you, Latasha.
You got it.
Welcome back from the break. Tony Kelly here, currently representing Oregon Realtors Government Affairs Key Committee. You'll learn a little more about me at the 11:30 panel, but I want to quickly share updates on fair housing and affordable housing policies we're championing here at Oregon Realtors. The first bill I'd like to review is an Oregon Realtors bill, House Bill 3088. This bill will establish an opt-in pilot program whereby tenants of participating landlords could elect to have their rent payment information sent to a consumer reporting agency in order to build and improve their credit rating. Participating landlords would be compensated for the costs associated with participating in the program. According to an NAR 2022 snapshots of race and home buying in America, 7% of African Americans and Hispanic Latino buyers had a mortgage application rejected, compared to 4% for white buyers and 3% for Asian Pacific Islander buyers. While the primary reason for mortgage application denial across all buyers was a high debt to income ratio, for Black African American buyers, the primary reason was a low credit score at 43%. And for Hispanic Latino buyers, a low credit score was the second most common reason at 33%. Occurring at a rate nearly double that of white buyers at 18% and more than 3 times that of Asian Pacific Islander buyers at 10%. As Leah Rothstein mentioned in her presentation prior to the break, Oregon Realtors is in agreement that by creating a system whereby tenants can build credit by simply paying their rent, we can begin to close the mortgage denial rate gap. The second bill I'd like to briefly touch on is Senate Bill 702. This bill would require that appraiser certification and licensure board to include state and federal housing laws and topics of implicit bias, including racial bias, and educational requirements for certification or licensure of appraisers and the registration of appraiser assistants. In late October 2022, the Federal Housing Finance Agency publicly released 47 million appraisal reports. Researchers examining the data found that communities with higher proportions of white residents had higher appraised values for their homes than similar, less white communities by comparing communities with nearly identical housing stock to each other. According to a New York Times article for November 2022, the researchers found that on average, homes in neighborhoods where the majority of residents are white are appraised for $371,000 more than in neighborhoods where the majority of residents are people of color. This is a gap in value that has increased 75% since 2013. Closing the racial gap in home appraisals is key to reducing the overall wealth gap between white Americans and Americans of color. Another analysis conducted by Zillow found that housing disparities account for 38.4%, or about $1.18 trillion of the overall $3 trillion median Black-white wealth gap. If the typical Black-owned home was worth the same as the typical white-owned home, Black wealth would more than double from $930 billion to $2.1 trillion. These are just a few of the bills that Oregon Realtors key committees is reviewing right now during this easy for me to say, during this legislative session. Thanks for this time, and back to you, Latasha.
Thank you, Tony. We appreciate all you are doing for Oregon Realtors. That's awesome. We really appreciate that update. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Brandy Snowden, Director of Member and Consumer Research at the National Association of Realtors. Brandy has been researching and analyzing data with NAR, National Association of Realtors, for the last 8 years. She earned her master's in urban and regional planning from Georgetown University. Brandy is going to share a study she co-authored on demographic trends in homeownership and the very real reported barriers buyers experience that show that fair housing is very much a topic we still need to be discussing. Take it away, Brandy.
Thank you again, Latasha, for having me here to speak with you today. And I'll just share my screen. And yeah, I'm very happy to be able to share a couple updated stats to what Tony mentioned previously from our 2022 report. So our 2023 report actually comes out next week. So you're getting a little sneak preview of some of our latest trends that we've been seeing from this report. And like was mentioned before, I work on this report with my colleague Nadia Evangelou, who is the Director of Real Estate Research at NAR. And in this report, we are looking at primarily 2 types of data sets. So in her section, she's looking at the differences among race and homeownership gaps among different races. And then in our second and third sections of the report, we're taking a look at our survey research data at recent home buyers and recent home sellers, and looking at some of the trends among our different races of recent home buyers, and also some of the challenges that they have faced when entering home ownership. So starting out, we'll go through the first section of the report. So looking at some of these home ownership rates data. So even just looking beyond the home ownership rates, we see that housing affordability also reached historic lows in 2022. And with that, we saw rising mortgage rates and home prices, and that also significantly hurt housing affordability. And that also forced many buyers out of the market, or would-be buyers from entering the market. So we've seen that especially for our potential first-time home buyers, that it may not even just be mortgage rates. We see that rents continue to increase, and that makes it harder for them to save for their down payment. So we're seeing that they're facing lots of challenges just to enter home ownership. But going into our home ownership rates, and this all comes from our snapshot report. So we have seen that looking by race, that the home ownership rate for white Americans has consistently been near 70% since 2017. And then during the same period, we see that the home ownership rate for Black Americans has been nearly 30 percentage points lower than that of white Americans. And so we see that it has, been significantly lower in comparison. And then for our Hispanic Americans, we see that the home ownership rate has held above 47%. And then for Asian Americans, it has been above 59% in the same time period. And then over the last decade, we've seen that Asian and Hispanic Americans have experienced the largest home ownership rate gains. And the home ownership rate for Hispanic Americans rose by nearly 5 percentage points within the last 10 years. And that pushed the rate above 50%. And although we see that the home ownership rate for Black households has rose by about 0.4 percentage points since 2011. So we see that it's still lower than 45%. And as a result, we see that that large gap between white and Black households is even larger in 2021. And then we can also look at the home ownership rates by state and also by race. So first, looking at the white home ownership rates, we see that Delaware, Mississippi, and South Carolina were the states with the highest home ownership rates for white Americans in 2021. And that's in contrast to Washington, D.C., Hawaii, and California, which had the lowest home ownership rates for white Americans. And then we can also look at Oregon. So the home ownership rate was 67% for white Americans in 2021. And then looking at our Asian and Pacific Islander home ownership rates, we see that Mississippi and Hawaii were the states with the highest home ownership rates for Asian Americans in 2021. So that's at Mississippi, Florida, and Hawaii. So it was at 76%, 73, and then 73 also for Hawaii. And we see that in Oregon, the home ownership rate was 62% for Asian American. And then looking at the Hispanic home ownership rates, we see that West Virginia, New Mexico, and also Vermont had the highest home ownership rates for Hispanic Americans. And that's in comparison to North Dakota, New York, and also Massachusetts, which had the lowest home ownership rates for Hispanic Americans. And then in Oregon, we see that the home ownership rate was 47%. And then looking at our Black home ownership rates, we see that South Carolina, Delaware, and also Mississippi were the states with the highest home ownership rates for Black Americans in 2021. And that's in comparison to North Dakota, South Dakota, and also Alaska, which had the lowest home ownership rates for Black Americans. And then looking at Oregon, we see that that number was 39%. And then looking just across the country, we see that that home ownership rate really varies from 15% to 55% for the Black home ownership rates by states. And then even looking beyond some of the affordability challenges, we see that Black and Hispanic home buyers are also facing extra challenges in getting a mortgage. And we see the denial rates vary significantly by race and ethnic groups, with Black Americans having the highest denial rates for purchase and also refinance loans. And we can also look at this data by state. So looking at first the white denial rates for mortgages, we see that West Virginia, Florida, and Mississippi were the states with the highest denial rates for white Americans in 2021. And then looking in Oregon, that was just 9%. And then looking at our Asian applicants, we see that Florida, Mississippi, and Rhode Island were the states with the highest denial rates for Asian Americans. And then again, looking at Oregon, the denial rate for Asian applicants, was 10%. And looking at our Hispanic applicants, we see that Mississippi, Rhode Island, and also New York were the states with the highest denial rates for those Americans in 2021. And then in Oregon for our Hispanic applicants, that was at 10%. And then finally, looking at our Black applicants, we see that Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina were the states with the highest denial rates for Black Americans in 2021. And then we see that those denial rates varied from 11 to 29% across the country. And in Oregon, it was 13% for our Black applicants. And another thing that Nadia notes in this section of the report is that looking at the local and state level, that in states with high concentrations of Black households, the denial rate is disproportionately high for Black homeowners and buyers. And from this data, low income seems to be the main reason that more Black households were denied for mortgages in those areas. And then next, looking at the second section of our snapshot report. So this is where we use data from our profile of home buyers and sellers report. And we take this data and actually cut it by all of our different races and ethnicities to see further trends within the home buying process. And then also just ways and challenges that our recent home buyers faced. So first, looking among all of our buyers, we see that white and Caucasian home buyers made up the largest share of recent home buyers at 88%. And that's followed by our Hispanic Latino home buyers at 8%, Black African American home buyers at 3%, and then Asian and Pacific Islander home buyers at 2%. And then we also have 3% of our recent home buyers identifying as other. And we saw that just in this past year that the shares for white and Hispanic home buyers increased. So we saw that just this past year that our, as you can see in this chart, the white share was down to 82%. So we saw it increase up to 88%. And then we saw slight increases among our Hispanic home buyers. So just in 2022, it was up from 7% the previous year. And then looking at some of the demographics of our recent home buyers, and these are just some of the many different demographic trends that we look at in this report, but picking out a few that are pretty interesting to look at. We ask our recent buyers if they purchased a multi-generational home. So looking at the overall share, we saw that our Hispanic and Latino home buyers were the most likely to purchase a multi-generational home. And that's followed by our African American and also white and Caucasian home buyers at 14%. And then this past year, we saw that just 12% of Asian Pacific Islander home buyers chose to purchase a multi-generational home. But looking further into the reasons that some of these home buyers are choosing to purchase a multi-generational home includes just spending more time with aging parents, helping with the caretaking of aging parents and relatives. They're also looking for a home that multiple incomes can afford together. and also for all of the cost savings that can be provided from living in a multi-generational home. And then looking at the second bar, so the green bar, we ask about our household composition of our recent home buyers. So one trend that often sticks out is the single female buyers, and we see that the largest percentage is actually among our Black and African American home buyers at 27%, and that's followed by our Asian Pacific Islander home buyers at 24%. And then we see that 17% of our white and Caucasian recent buyers were single females, and then just 7% among Hispanic and Latino home buyers. And then another interesting thing to see. So our gray bar here, we ask if the recent buyer was a first-time home buyer or if they were a repeat buyer. So we also see that the largest share of our first-time home buyers was among African Americans and Black home buyers at 49%. And that's followed by our Asian Pacific Islander home buyers at 43%. 32% of our Hispanic Latino buyers were first-time home buyers, and then 24% of white and Caucasian buyers. And then we also ask about the down payment sources that our recent home buyers use towards their down payment. And we see that looking across race and ethnicities that savings overall was the top way that our recent home buyers were getting the money to put down towards their down payment. But then it's also interesting to see that looking at past home equity, so the sales from a previous home, that white and Caucasian buyers were the most likely to say that was part of their down payment source. And then also looking at our Black and African American home buyers, we see the highest share of recent home buyers that were dipping into their 401k to get money to put down towards their down payment. And then another trend that we've been seeing, especially among our younger home buyers, is the help from families, so in the form of a loan or a gift towards their down payment. And we see that Asian Pacific Islander home buyers were actually the most likely to report receiving that type of help at 29%. And then also looking at the impact that student loan debt can have on our recent home buyers, we saw that, and this is actually a change from last year from what we had previously seen. So we see that this year, Hispanic and Latino home buyers reported having student loan debt at the highest share at 46%. And we see that Black and African American home buyers reported 33% of them reported having student loan debt. We had previously seen that Black and African American home buyers made up the largest share, reporting that they had student loan debt. So it's interesting to see how, the data can change. And it's also important to look further into the student loan debt amounts, and then also how education can also factor into that. So when we ask about the median student loan debt amount, we see that, again, Hispanic Latino home buyers reported having the largest student loan debt amount at $70,000, which is very surprising to see, but also looking at the education levels. And we see that a large share this year of our Hispanic Latino home buyers reported having master's degree, MBA, or law degrees. So we think that that can factor into the large amounts of student loan debts, so working towards that higher and postgraduate degrees. And then we still see that our Black and African American home buyers reported having the second highest amount of student loan debt at $35,300. And then our Asian Pacific Islander and white and Caucasian home buyers reported having around $30,000 in student loan debt. And then also looking at in our report, so we ask our recent home buyers about during their recent home buying process, if they have experienced any discrimination throughout their transaction. And then we also ask a couple more questions about their experience and their neighborhood. So one of the questions that we ask our recent home buyers, and I know I was listening in earlier, so I know we've been talking about how neighborhoods can be segregated, not even maybe not even without realizing it, but we ask our recent home buyers if the majority of their neighborhood is the same race as them. And we see that it's especially interesting to see when we break it down by race that 68% of both Black and African American and Hispanic and Latino home buyers reported that the majority of their neighborhood was not the same race as them, with 59% of Asian and Pacific Islander buyers reporting that as well. And that's in comparison to just 11% of our white and Caucasian home buyers. And then looking at the opposite of that, we see that 75% of white and Caucasian home buyers reported that their neighborhood was the same race as them. And that's compared with just 19% of Black and African American and Asian Pacific Islander home buyers and 17% of Hispanic and Latino home buyers. Then we also ask about ways that they may have witnessed or experienced discrimination throughout their home buying process. So this is also very interesting to see. And looking first at our Hispanic and Latino home buyers, they were the most likely to say that they either witnessed or experienced steering towards a particular neighborhood, steering either towards or away from a specific neighborhood. And then also the second top reason for Hispanic Latino home buyers was the refusal for homeowners or an agent to show a particular property. And then looking at our Black and African American home buyers, this is another topic that we've seen coming up, is the appraisal of their home. So 39% of Black and African American home buyers reported that they felt discriminated in that way towards their home appraisal. And that's also followed by similarly what we see from the Hispanic and Latino home buyers. So refusal for homeowners or agents to show a particular property. So overall, we see that those were some of the top ways that our recent home buyers were feeling or experiencing or witnessing discrimination. And then also looking at, we also ask about if they experience discrimination in a real estate transaction, in which ways they experience discrimination, or if they were experiencing discrimination based on any of our protected classes. So we see that among our Black and African American home buyers, 8% felt discriminated based on their race, 5% based on their color, 2% based on sex, and then we see that among our Asian and Pacific Islander home buyers, 4% felt they were discriminated based on their race and 3% by color. So then we also see a larger percentage that may not have experienced discrimination, but still believe that it exists throughout the home buying process. And then we also ask if they're if they were discriminated against, if they reported that discrimination to a government agency. And we did see that this number, particularly among our Black and African American home buyers, did slightly increase from last year. So it is up to 12% that say that they actually reported the discrimination. And then among our white and Caucasian buyers, 3% said that they actually reported that discrimination. And again, this is just a couple highlights from the full report that will be released next week. So I would look on our website maybe later in the week next week. So if you're interested in seeing the full report, yeah, I would definitely suggest taking a look at that. Now we'll turn it back to Natasha.
Thank you, Brandy. Do you have time for a few questions?
Sure.
Just one of the questions was the percentages. One of the questions was, are these percentages of the total population or by group? I think those were some of the first slides you were discussing.
Was it the home ownership rate?
I think it might have been the homeownership rate.
And you asked if it was based on population.
Or by group. Are these percentages of the total population or by group?
I believe based on total population.
Okay, and then regarding those denial rates you discussed, was there data on the reason given for the denial? I know you talked about it briefly, it just might have got missed.
So there is data on the reasons in our profile of home buyers and sellers. So that is in the full report, that chart. I believe Tony had mentioned some of the reasons from last year. So we still see some similar trends there.
Awesome. And the asterisks on the slides, on the neighborhood resident and discrimination slide, is that just for less than 1% reported?
Yes, it is.
I just wanted to clarify that for the room. Thank you so much for your time today. We so appreciate all that research and expertise that you put into gathering that report, and it's very well laid out. So thank you for that. It just reminds us there's so many layers to fair housing, the law, the ethics, and the business case. So the more inclusive our practices are, the more we can learn to better serve our diverse clientele and be better positioned for the changing buyer power here in Oregon. So drop your ahas in the chat. Thank Brandy for her time and her slides. And like she mentioned, that full report will come out. And so you'll be able to dig into that and probably get a little bit more detail as you peruse that. Great information to share as well. Because, you know, knowledge is power, and the more we know, the more we can grow. While we are getting those dropped into the chat, your aha reflections, we have a quick video to introduce our next panel. Before I pass it off to our final moderator, the amazing 2023 Oregon Realtors Diversity Key Committee Vice Chair, Ashley Contreras, who will be moderating our next panel. And Ashley will take over once we play a short video about our next panel.
We are NAHREP.
Oregon. NAHREP's mission is to increase sustainable Hispanic home ownership. NAHREP believes the home ownership is critical for Latinos to build generational wealth. Home ownership also promotes stability, freedom, and becoming vested in a community.
NAHREP empowers an inclusive network of over 40,000 individual real estate professionals and 100 local chapters that serve Latino home buyers.
NAHREP publishes 3 widely quoted housing, wealth building, and industry reports. State of Hispanic Homeownership Report tracks trends and forecasts Latino homeownership acquisition.
NAHREP organizes and executes 2 major conferences, National Convention and Housing Policy Summit, brings together national membership, partners, and policy leaders in the spring to change lives through advocacy and building Latino wealth.
How can you help? We will be conducting 3 virtual events in which we need your participation and collaboration. We will be measured by attendance and sponsorship. In order for us to become an official chapter in the state of Oregon, we need all your support. Remember, NAHREP in Oregon is about access and equity in home ownership for all. Acceso y equidad de vivienda para todos.
Hi everyone, we are the Portland chapter of AREA, the Asian Real Estate Association of America. Woo! And we're sending our greetings from our national conference in San Diego, California. AREA dedicates itself to promoting homeownership solutions to the API community. And one of the key initiatives I'm really excited to share is our support of HR 123, which provides additional credit information to mortgage lenders. And lastly, I want to invite everybody to our signature event of the year, the Installation Gala on December 3rd at 5 p.m. See you there!
I'm Tony Kelly, president of Oregon Realtors, the newest board of the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, or NAHREP. NAHREP was founded in 1947 as an equal opportunity and civil rights advocacy organization for African American real estate professionals, consumers, and communities in America. The purpose of NARAB is to enhance the economic improvement of its members, the community at large, and the minority community which it serves. NARAB was founded because up until 1961, African Americans were not allowed to be members of NAR, or the National Association of Realtors. Now, NARAB works very closely with the National Association of Realtors. So our chapter here in Oregon was established in August of 2022. And on a local level, our major intent is to enhance generational wealth building abilities for the African American community, as well as to provide the public on homeownership opportunities. How can you get involved? Well, the simple answer is please participate in our events that we're going to be holding throughout the year. Our aim is to have some type of event, either a networking or educational event that takes place every 4 to 6 weeks. And you can also go to our website, which is OregonNARAB.com. I hope to see you at a future event. Thank you.
All right, so ready to go into this last section. So I was at the ARIA Gala event back in December and it was awesome. I can't wait for this year's. I'm Ashley Contreras. It is my pleasure to moderate this final session. I'm joined by our incredible panelists to talk about how they're impacting fair housing within their communities and some practical tips for us as real estate practitioners. We've got a full agenda, so please forgive me as I speed through introductions. We will have optional breakout rooms with each of these groups afterwards so you can dive in deeper with them. From the Asian Real Estate Association of America is Tam Hickson. As an at-home with diversity certified realtor, Tam began her real estate career in 2016 with Windermere Realty Trust to empower people in every community to move authentically in the direction of their homeownership goals. She currently serves as ARIA Portland's Vice President, a PMAR local director, and on the Community Warehouse Board of Directors. Not featured in our introduction video is the new LGBTQ+ Alliance Portland Metro President, Alexa Lockman. Born and raised in South Africa during the dismantling of apartheid, Alexa immigrated to Portland at age 16, where she had to learn to navigate a new culture with little preparation. After over a decade as a high school teacher, Alexa transitioned to real estate with a passion for educating her clients about current market conditions, so they can make empowered decisions about their investments and build wealth through homeownership, no matter where they come from. Representing the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals is Gabriela Mann. Gabriela graduated with honors from Portland State University, focusing her study in business, finance, and accounting. Gabriela is the 2023 chair of the Diversity, Equity, Access, and Inclusion Committee at Keller Williams Realty Professionals, a board member of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and incoming president of NAREP Western Oregon. Our final panelist is a face you'll recognize from today, the incredible Tony Kelly. Tony is a veteran principal broker with over 20 years of experience as a realtor in the Portland metro area. He's currently a doctoral candidate at George Fox University in the business school, on track to graduate in summer 2023. He has an MBA in marketing and is a proud United States Air Force Academy graduate with a Bachelor's of Science degree. He is co-owner and co-founder of Keller Williams Realty Portland Premier, helping grow the office from 4 agents to 250 agents and over $1 billion in yearly sales transactions. Thank you, panelists, for joining us today. I am awed by your accomplishments. We have about 20 minutes and quite a few questions to go over, so let's dive right in. First question, I'm going to ask Tam to start us off with this. Tam, can you tell us, how does your affinity group impact fair housing, and what are your fair housing goals, or ARIA's fair housing goals, for 2023?
Sure, thanks, Ashley, and I'm so glad you made it to ARIA's Gala last year. I'm really happy to share that 2023 marks ARIA's 20th anniversary and ARIA Portland's 10th anniversary. As we've learned today, fair housing is a fundamental right for all people, including Asians, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. With 43 chapters, ARIA is committed to advancing equitable home ownership for the AAPI community. At the national level, ARIA has helped to make Asians a standalone category in the Census Bureau's homeownership report and translate FHFA documents. Additionally, ARIA's annual Diversity and Fair Housing Summit will take place in Washington, D.C. during AAPI Heritage Month to meet with elected officials and AAPI changemakers about housing policies. Locally, our Portland chapter has a few fair housing goals. First, we're going to better understand our community's language needs and prioritize language access. And two, we're going to continue increasing our visibility in the community, which promotes not only housing equity, but much needed diversity in our profession. And finally, we're raising awareness through a coalition with our fellow affinity groups, as you see here today, and partnering with community-based organizations that serve AAPIs.
Thank you. Alexa, do you want to answer the same question? How is your affinity group impacting fair housing, and what are your goals for 2023?
Absolutely. So interestingly enough, not a lot of data on LGBTQ folks at this Fair Housing Summit, and that's kind of something that we'd like to change. Only 49% of our population currently owns homes nationally compared to a 65% national average. And so our number one goal is to increase home ownership among the LGBTQ community and to educate ourselves as professionals in our industry how to do that and why that number is lower. We also put on trainings for ourselves and our members. We have a training coming up in Pride Month in June for allyship, which we encourage you all to attend. We'll be addressing implicit bias and things like that against our community also. What's great about our community is that it's a natural collaborative jumping point for all of the other affinity groups because we do have cross-pollination between our members and their members. So we're really looking forward to establishing those relationships and really kind of growing this collaborative network of all of us fighting for fair housing in Oregon and nationally. Of course, we're really interested in growing our chapter. We're newly established. We have a lot of energy. So we welcome allies, anybody involved in real estate to join us. We put on quarterly CE for our members. We're partnering with Outside In for our service. And we don't quite know what our event will look like, but Aria, we're coming for you. We know that gala is where it's at, and we're going to try to help you.
Thanks, Alexa. Gabrielle, you want to tell us what NAHREP's working on in 2023?
100%. So for some of you that don't know what NAHREP stands for, is National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Our chapter is Western Oregon, and we are very happy to bring this chapter finally to the state of Oregon. We are very close to get the chapter finalized and approved by nationals, which is what part of what we are focusing for the remaining of 2023. The goal that we have is really to bridge the gap of wealth building for Hispanics by advocating, educating, and pushing really to make changes in policies that can affect homeownership. I think part of what we are trying to accomplish for the remaining of this year is really educate realtors, lenders, everybody who has a stake in homeownership in the state of Oregon, that communities are different, and we really need to come from contribution and understanding the specific needs of communities in order for us to make changes. These changes had to happen from coming from, again, understanding the needs of our communities. We are looking really forward to having the support of all of you. We are going to be conducting our second webinar that will take place this April 4 from 2 to 2:45, and it will be very, very good, and a lot of value will be in this webinar. What we need from you again is participation, collaboration, be there, working together. We can get farther along this fight for fair housing.
Thanks, Gabriella. And let's hear from Tony about NAHREP.
Yeah, so NAHREP was founded in 1947, actually making it the oldest minority professional trade association in America. It was formed out of a need to secure the right to equal housing opportunities regardless of race, creed, or color. Since its inception, we've participated in some of the most meaningful impactful legislative activities. See, I got that word right that time. To establish fair housing for all, such as the first local fair housing legislation, which was passed in 1962 in New York City, the first state fair housing legislation, which was passed in 1963 in California, and the first national fair housing legislation, which in both 1947 and 1968. On a local level, our Oregon Realtors Board, which we just reestablished in August of last year, our aim is to foster the expansion of intergenerational wealth creation by Black households in Oregon and Southwest Washington through promoting the retention and the acquisition of real property investments. NAREP's credo on a national level is democracy in housing. And this is really the driving tenet for all the Oregon Realtors activities in our education, awareness, networking activities, all through 2023. And as I mentioned, NAREP was created in 1947, and this is a time when Blacks weren't allowed to be members of NAR. I mentioned in the video that we weren't allowed to be members until 1961, which probably seems like a long time ago for a lot of people, but that was the same decade that I was born. So it's not that long ago. And so reestablishing this NAREP board, though, I will say, was principally driven and guided but with critical support from Oregon Realtors. And our full events calendar in 2023 was made possible by the support of Oregon Realtors, PMAR, and RMLS.
Thank you, Tony. Okay, our next question for the panel is, what are your best practices for ensuring clients are getting an equitable experience with you? Let's start with Tam. Tam, do you have an answer for this one?
Yeah, I would say it is so incredibly important to take the time to truly understand what every client needs. For me, asking the right questions is built into my business. It's part of the process when I'm meeting with the client, and to not assume that I know where a client wants to live based on their perceived or actual identity. Furthermore, it's also important that we recognize when we as real estate professionals may not be the best fit for what our clients need. And then do we have the resources and do we take initiative to connect our clients with others who might be a better resource? And if our clients suspect housing discrimination, if we suspect it and experience it, encouraging our clients to file a complaint, utilizing those resources, and then actively being supportive and accompany them through that process, because it may be very daunting and overwhelming. And I just want to say too that our communities that you're hearing about are not a monolith. Really look behind the numbers. Asians, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders are made up of incredibly diverse communities with very different challenges. And I will have to say, just here representing ARIA, that the model minority myth is a dangerous perspective that harms all marginalized communities. And so I really want to encourage us to challenge that. I have much more to say, but limited time. So please join ARIA's breakout room a little bit later, and you can scan the QR code there too.
Thank you, Tam. Tony, do you want to add anything to that about best practice? Best practices for ensuring clients are getting an equitable experience with you?
I would say, looking at it literally at a 50,000 foot level, I would just say we need to acknowledge that housing discrimination still occurs. There is still racial discrimination that happens on a regular basis. I can say from my personal experience, in fact, last year, I serve on a particular committee, and I'm serving one of my white colleagues in this particular committee is arguing with me that he doesn't believe that there's really a racial discrimination issue in housing because in his small town, he doesn't see it. So I'm like, okay, great. I got a white male telling me about my lived experience. And so I'm like, this is really frustrating, but it's an educational process. And so I think, honestly, just going all the way back, or going to a very high level, we just have to acknowledge that it happens. It's still happening. It's 2023. And unless we acknowledge that it happens, we can't actually prevent it from happening, and we can't address it. So that would be the highest level thing for me.
And if I could just jump in on there, I think, for us, gender identity and sexual identity are not orientation are not even protected federal classes, right? So this is a fight we're still fighting. Here in Oregon, they are, but nationally it's not. And so just having sensitivity around the fact that when you're dealing with, for instance, legal documentation, it might deviate completely from someone's lived experience of how they present in the world. And so again, not assuming how someone presents in the world or how you view them through your heteronormative lens as how they present can change the difference between someone being comfortable with you or feeling like they have to hide who they are to get through a legal process. So some kind of signaling. I think a lot of our folks walk into office buildings and immediately kind of look for safety first, some kind of sign or image. You don't have to have rainbows everywhere. It's not that necessary or obvious, but like just some kind of token signaling of like, we're open to you presenting as who you are and saying who you are in a process where a lot of times heteronormativity and home ownership kind of tend to go together because of traditional ideas of like what home is.
Can I add to that?
Jump in here.
Okay, so I mean, we're coming back to education. Education is power. I think it takes educating ourselves as realtors, as the provider of information, be the source of information, and also provide how to get access to that information and how we can help. Unfortunately, we continue to see behaviors that should not be happening, and they continue to happen for communities underrepresented and underserved. So we really need to ramp up our game and be better and, you know, continue to grow and learn every day. But also it's a responsibility of us to educate the more we can to the people that are around us. What is fair for you may not be fair for me. What is racist to you may not be racist to me. And we need to be aware and be sensitive to all these issues.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabriela. Well, great thing that we're all here today, because I'm sure that we'll all walk away with a little bit more, you know, dialogue in our pockets to kind of participate in these types of conversations. Our final question, if we have time for one more, we might do one more, but next question is, what do you see as a common fair housing mistake, and how should audience members avoid these? Does anyone want to start off with this one?
I will. I just want to say that when I read this question, I didn't really know, I mean, where to come from answering the question. So I just gonna say what I think, okay? So fair housing mistakes, I think, and this is my opinion, we really need to make the changes from top to bottom. What I mean with this is we had people that are in charge of making decisions and create these systems and, you know, systems and changes to these systems, but unless you have a stake to these communities, unless this diversity exists from the very top to the bottom, really the effectiveness of these policies will not happen. We can be talking about fair housing all day long, but until the message really gets to where it needs to get, and the people that are in charge, again, of making these changes don't have the diversity or the equity of people that we want to see, we really are not going to see the results. The other big problem that I see happening is agencies that are in charge of creating programs that can assist, for example, first-time home buyers. They are not working together. They are not speaking together. And in most cases, they are competing with one with another for funds available. So look at those things. I mean, I heard recently some, you know, agencies that don't have any more money to give to first-time home buyers in Medford or Grants Pass, when here in Portland, there is plenty of these resources and we don't have enough buyers. So those things should not exist. When creating, again, this way of giving up money, we need to be looking at the specific needs of our communities. And also, we are all different. Tammy was explaining, you know, you are very, Asian is a very broad community. Well, the same thing with Hispanics. You know, Cuban are different from Mexican. Mexicans are different from people from El Salvador. We may speak the same language, but we have very different, you know, characteristics, and there is something in each of us that make us different. So be very sensitive to all those things when created a broad campaign to approach fair housing.
Thank you, Gabriela. Tony, do you want to add to that question? Common fair housing mistakes and how audience members can avoid them?
I think one of the things that we can avoid, and I think we all fall prey to, is intentional or unintentional stereotyping. You know, during I'm currently working on my dissertation, and I'm hoping to have this wrapped up by June and finally be done with this 4-year process. But you know, one of the things I've come across multiple times in my literature review is the inimical impact of stereotyping, and a lot of times it's not intentional. It's unintentional stereotyping that we all fall prey to. And I think we just need to be conscious of that when you're working with your clients, as well as other agents.
And just adding to that too, I think having a lens that exists outside of your lived experience is really helpful. So just like we tend to live in communities that are like us, I mean, we tend to kind of like think the way that we live. And so I've seen, for instance, in a lot of trainings, people will start their training off with like, you know, sharing a slide about their home and their family. And just kind of having a lens to think about like, how is that coming across to someone who maybe doesn't come from generational wealth, doesn't own a home, doesn't have a traditional family, et cetera? Like, are you sharing about yourself, or are you creating an environment where someone might feel uncomfortable to say, like, I don't fit into that pattern, like that's not my experience? And I think that's kind of what we're all saying is like within every population that's represented here, there's like infinite ways of identifying and experiencing the world. It all comes from, as Tony was saying, having that curious mindset and asking first instead of making those assumptions. And especially, I say this to my friends too, when people are like, how do you get friends who are people of color? You know, if you are a person and you find yourself without a diverse friend group or a diverse realtor group or a diverse whatever, get out there and start joining groups, start attending events, start asking questions, just get curious, because people want to connect and we need to collaborate on these kinds of things to make any kind of meaningful action happen. So just get out of your comfort zone.
Thank you, Alexa. I like that point because I know, I think community can be so powerful, and just connecting sometimes can be healing and kind of further these messages for sure. So I do appreciate that point. Did anyone want to add before we move on to our last question?
I'll just add one thing in that you do see several, different groups here, but it is not that group's problem. So I just want to emphasize that, we're all doing this together. We cannot be loud enough on our own. We are building our networks, but I'm very encouraged by the coalition that is being built and the momentum. But a question that many of us get is who can join? And I will say, I hear it all the time. All are welcome. If you believe in our mission, if you believe in improving the gap, just please join. We all need everyone at the table.
Thanks, Tam. We definitely at Oregon Realtors and the Diversity Committee see training opportunities surrounding fair housing reporting coming up. Definitely room to improve and add more information there. In your mind, does anyone want to share what you see as barriers for reporting fair housing violations?
Well, I think if I can start, in my experience, I see that access to the information, for example, in different languages. In the Hispanic community, you also deal with issues that, many older generations may not even know how to use technology. So how would you expect someone to have access or to feel comfortable to go to a website to just complete a form so you can file a report? Many times they don't even know how to use email. So making those systems easier for someone perhaps to just pick up the phone and file the complaint. And, many times people feel afraid. I mean, am I going to have, is there's going to be a repercussion? Something is going to happen to me for reporting this person. So I can tell you that I had heard several instances of either lenders and brokers that had done what they were not supposed to do, took advantage of people, but nobody did anything. And that culture has to stop.
I think also, sadly, there are so many people who are used to microaggressions on such a daily basis that when it comes to something that is actually a legal issue in fair housing, they may dismiss it because they're not aware that it's actually such a big problem. And so I think, for those of us in the industry, educating our clients and really having relationships with them where they feel comfortable coming to us and telling us what they're experiencing when we're showing them that we may not even see is also really important.
I appreciate that point too. Anybody else want to add to this question for barriers for reporting?
I was just going to say ditto to what Gabby and Alexa just said, especially when Alexa, you brought up a really important point is there are certain segments of the population, especially, traditionally disenfranchised individuals or groups where microaggressions are just part of your daily experience. And when you're being discriminated against, you don't even necessarily think, hey, I should report this. You're just so used to it happening to you. And that's something that we have to get over.
Sure. Yeah, we can't change something we don't know about. So normalizing the reporting process definitely seems like something that would be great for our future. Awesome. Well, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you guys so much for participating. We're out of time for today. Tam, Gabriella, Alexa, and Tony, thank you for joining us. These groups will be reconvening at this year's spring governance, so keep an eye out. We will be emailing out more information as spring governance gets closer. And with that, it is my pleasure to hand it back over to Latasha to close us out.
All right. We are ready to close this out. Amazing insights our panelists shared. I think we're having really tough conversations. And so I just want to give a big kudos to everybody who showed up and joined us today. You guys are amazing. And that's what makes this successful. So thank you sincerely, all attendees who joined us today. There was a ton of information presented. So thanks for hanging out with us today. We truly appreciate you. If you are an Oregon Realtors member, your CE will be processed within 2 weeks and you will receive an email with instructions on how to access your CE certificate. Today would not have been possible without the support of our wonderful partners. So please join me in thanking them. Again, that's First American, Canopy, and Urban Nest. In the chat and on screen, you'll find the link to the feedback form, the much anticipated feedback form. Remember, in the feedback form, you'll have the opportunity to sign up for the Diversity Key Committee Book Club and enter to win one of the 100 free copies of the Just Action that we're giving away to attendees. The first 100 attendees to request it will get the book directly mailed to them. So I just want to take a second to see that get dropped and give you guys a second to fill it out. We will break into rooms, but I wanted to give everybody a chance to get that chat and to get the link for the feedback form so you can fill that out. We are going to try something new by going into breakout rooms. It will not be for CE. And so just take a second to check out that survey, and I'm going to give you about a minute or two, and then I'll jump back in with some final instructions on breaking into breakout rooms.